Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we are going to talk about Bobby Fischer and His World, an incredible book by international master John Donaldson. So I've had the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Donaldson recently, as you're going to see in the video, and you're going to hear his thoughts on the book. We were discussing Bobby Fischer for an hour or so, and that's going to be the main part of this video. But at the beginning, I'm going to give you my own review. First of all, John Donaldson, if you haven't heard of him, is what I figured out after reading two of his books, one of the greatest chess historians today. And he has written two books on Bobby Fischer recently, Bobby Fischer and His World, which we are going to talk about now, and his new book, Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, came out in 2025, so this year. We're going to talk about that next week. But he has recently, or previously, written two more. Firstly, The Unknown Bobby Fischer, and then A Legend on the Road, Bobby Fischer's 1964 Simul Tour. So his knowledge on Bobby Fischer is extraordinary. That's something I wanted to say to begin with. Other than that, he's an IM, of course, and he has served as a team captain in 26 Olympiads and World Team Championships. During our interview, he mentioned how he was Yasser Seyravan's second in the 87 zonal tournament in Zagreb. So he has a lot of playing experience, a lot of coaching experience, a lot of teaching experience, and a lot of experience as an author. He has also written two books on Rubinstein and two books on Alechin. So, an incredible person, and it was an honor to speak to him. You're going to listen to the interview in a bit. Now let's talk about the book. So Bobby Fischer and His World is about 600 pages long. These are my amateur bookmarks because there were too many things I wanted to mention. It's about 600 pages long, and it covers Bobby Fischer's life from when he began playing chess until his time in Iceland. And it covers every portion of his life equally well. Usually most Fischer books are either focused on the 72 match or the candidate matches leading up to that point, or the peak of his career, which was, let's say 66, 67 to 72. But very few of them discuss the time when he was not a prodigy at all, but he was just an average kid who liked to play chess, but he wasn't really good. And not many books covered the period in between 72 and 92. And John Donaldson did that. The book is unique for two reasons. Firstly, in equal proportion, you will find Donaldson's own text and the sources he quotes and includes. So the book includes letters, conversations, articles, full accounts of many events, and it also includes sort of mini books on every person that was significant in Fischer's life, including the junior players he competed against in 55, 56, 57. I had never heard of them before. When I would analyze a Fischer game from, let's say, 56, his opponents would be, NN to me. I didn't know anything about them. And in Bobby Fischer and His World, Donaldson talks in great detail about those people, and he also includes their references or what they had to say about Fischer. Many of them knew him, many of them were his friends, he spent time with many of them, and since in the beginning of his career, he was a kid, obviously, he usually needed someone to accompany him. So you'll find that he stayed with a certain family during this tournament there, and he spent a month with this person there. So stuff like that was completely new to me. Other than that, the events that took place in Fischer's life that were controversial, for example, his involvement with the Worldwide Church of God, his not defending the title against Karpov, the way he came to Belgrade in 92 whilst a war was waging and played the match against Spassky, all of that is described as well as his peak years that are well known. For example, you will find prep games he played against Svetozar Gligoric in Belgrade in preparation for Spassky. I had never heard of that before, and you get Gligoric's accounts of those events. You will also get detailed accounts of his 58 visit to Moscow before he went to play the candidates tournament, and it's just an incredibly rich book which contains original information and Donaldson's text. Now, what's most unique about it is that it's written as if it were a history book. What do I mean by that? Donaldson doesn't give his own opinions. There are no conjectures, there are no hypotheses, it's all fact, and he just presents the information in a way that's fun and easy to read. And I love that. Usually when you read chess books, they are abnormally dry in recent years, or very subjective if you read the old authors. So if you read, I don't know, Alechin, or if you read Lasker, Reti, Nimzovich, Tartakower, those were embellished not by misinformation or lies, but by their subjective opinions. And Donaldson doesn't do that. It's all fact. And I want to draw a parallel between Fischer and Donaldson in that respect, because Fischer was always highly objective in his own annotations, and he simply stated the facts. He did that in a very witty, salty, semi-aggressive way sometimes, but he didn't embellish his annotations, and neither does Donaldson. Now, the book includes 99 of Fischer's games, but it's not a game collection. It's a biography, or it's a collection of everything we know about Fischer. And many of the games hadn't been published before. The reason for that is that Donaldson had been given access to what's called Targ collection, among other collections. And Targ was Fischer's brother-in-law, his sister's husband. And in 2008, I think, his collection was given to the Marshall Chess Club. And Donaldson was given access to the collection briefly. He wasn't allowed to record games, but among other memorabilia and gems regarding Fischer's family, there were many score sheets. And John and I talked about that during our interview, so we're going to read about that in detail. So the book also contains a lot of new information and new games, not just tournament games. Bobby used to play thematic tournaments at the Manhattan Chess Club, for example, thematic Ruy Lopez tournaments, Spanish tournaments, and some of those games are included as well. So a lot of original information, a lot of original research, and my conclusion after reading this book, having read, Endgame and other books on Fischer before, is that this book makes almost all other biographies on Bobby Fischer obsolete, because everything you can find in other books is here. And whether you read all the other books or just this one, in fact, I think you'll get more from this single one. When I spoke to John, he actually said, when I asked him how I can find his other books, in particular the Unknown Bobby Fischer, which I'd been trying to find for a month now, he said everything that's in this book, everything that's in the old book has been covered in the new one as well. So, an amazing book. If you like Bobby Fischer, and I do, you might be surprised how little you know about him, or how little you knew about him before you read it. It's not a workbook. You aren't going to improve your calculation. The annotations to the 99 games are very good because they were either by Fischer or other authors. I just opened the random page on a Kasparov's piece of annotation, or by John Donaldson himself. He is, of course, an experienced IM and an author, so his annotations are good. But the book doesn't emphasize the games themselves. They were there to provide context to the timeline of Fischer's life. So it's suitable for anyone. I mean, whether you're a beginner or a grandmaster, it's equally good. There was, where was it? Yeah, Magnus Carlsen's short excerpt on the book, said, "I was reading Bobby Fischer and His World by John Donaldson in the days leading up to the 2022 World Rapid and Blitz, and it was a massive inspiration for my decisive last round game with Abdusattorov, where I played g5, g4, g5. I had a feeling during the game this position was very similar to Fischer-Anderson's Sieg in 1970. He is referring to the famous hedgehog in reverse, where Fischer played b3, knight f3, and then played king h1, rook g1, g4, g5, and so on. A very famous game. So it's a great book, and you should read it regardless of your strength. Now let's listen to my interview with John. Hi, John. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, as I said in my own review, I was blown away by the two books, and I want to begin by asking you about Bobby Fischer and His World, and more specifically, since you'd already written books on Fischer before, how did you come up with the idea to write this Fischer Bible?
Well, that's very kind of you to refer to it as such. When I started playing in 1972, like perhaps some of your listeners, and it was a result, of course, of the World Championship match that year. And not long after I started playing, I read two books by Frank Brady. They were both called Profile of a Prodigy, and they were like the first and second editions, but they were really quite different books. I mean, oftentimes the second edition is just like the first edition with a tiny bit added and maybe some corrections, but these were like two clearly unique books. And later, of course, many years passed, and Frank Brady published Endgame, and I read that as well. And having read all three of those books, I felt like I knew Fischer much better. But I also had a lot of questions, because one thing with Fischer, unlike some of the other world champions, it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole with him, if you will. There's just so many different aspects of his life, and a lot of them are not always sort of in the public, so you have to really dig deep to sort of try to figure out what's going on. So essentially, after reading those three books, I decided that I would try to answer all the unanswered questions I had. And that was really the major impetus for it. I had written a book also earlier, two books on Fischer. One was a book on his exhibition tour in 1964. And I'd also written a work with Eric Tangborn called The Unknown Bobby Fischer that was published in the mid to late 1990s. And both those books sort of whet my appetite to try to go much beyond that. And so, well, I thought also that, Frank Brady's a very experienced writer, a brilliant writer, an excellent researcher, and a famous arbiter, but perhaps not quite as strong a player. So I thought also it'd be interesting to add the perspective of somebody who's a little stronger in that area.
Okay. I have to ask you one question, which struck me after reading the first 50 or so pages. For context, I'm a medieval archaeologist, by vocation, and during my college years, I used to read a lot. I used to read a lot of history and a lot of archaeology, and I used to read a lot of old authors. You studied history, right? Am I
I
correct?
did at the University of Washington, yes, in
Yeah.
Seattle.
So you must have read books by, authors from the early 20th century or 19th century, regardless of your area of study. They used to be way more subjective, like Alechin when he writes his annotations, whereas historians today are very dry, very objective. They tend to focus on facts. And when I was reading Bobby Fischer and His World, I couldn't help but notice that not even once have you given your own opinion on something. Instead, you presented what you knew were facts, or what were probably facts, and then you pointed out that they might have been good guesses. And at first, I couldn't decide whether I liked that or not. But as I went on, as I kept reading, uh, that was my favorite part about the book. I don't know why, but I really enjoyed having someone present me with all the relevant information without any guesswork. Have you done that on purpose, or?
Well, yes, I think in the case of Fischer, obviously he's probably one of the most controversial of all the world champions, uh, especially for his life after the 72 match. But even before that, there were a lot of major episodes, if you will. And so I felt that the fairest thing I could do would be to lay out the facts as best I could, and then the reader make his own decision on a lot of these things. Because for some of them, I think that it's not always so clear, and different people could interpret things differently.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you, and I can. I found that strong chess players tend to evaluate positions uh, very broadly without saying white's better, black's better, whereas weaker players, such as myself, tend to be very optimistic in their evaluations. And the same goes for authors. Experienced authors who know a lot, in my experience, often tend to refrain from giving their own opinions. And yeah, I can also mention Alekhine and Bogolyubov. Recently, I've read a lot on them, and you must know about Alekhine's article written for Nazi propaganda, basically
Yes.
on Jewish and Aryan chess. And Bogolyubov was a member of the National Socialist Party as well. So reading on them and trying to figure out how those controversies were dealt with in the chess world made everything Fischer did, very pale in comparison.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
Alekhine still being the world champion in 46, having to deal with the fact that everyone thought that he was a traitor and a collaborator. But yeah, I found it very interesting to compare the dramas in different chess players' lives, and I think you
Yes.
presented that part of Fischer's life very, very well.
Yeah, I could add, I mean, Bogolyubov and Alekhine, it's a for both of them, definitely, there was uh, engagement with Nazis, but the question is under what conditions it happened. I mean,
Yeah,
uh, Alekhine was living with his American wife in Paris, and Bogolyubov, was a Ukrainian living in Germany. He was a Slav, and it couldn't have been that easy for either of them. I mean, granted, it could also be that they just wanted to, do what they like to do, which was play chess. And so they would, for example, they both traveled to Poland during the Second World War, and Frank, one of the high-ranking Nazi officials, was a
yeah,
big chess fan. So, you know, it, it's 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 I think that it's one of those situations where people can, can come up with different conclusions. But I think the important thing is to try to gather as much information before you make your decision.
yeah, yeah. Of course, I recently finished reading the book called Alekhine's Odessa Secrets. It
Hmm.
speaks about his period before and shortly after the First World War. It doesn't address his later life at all, and just mentions briefly the facts. But I still haven't made my mind up, and the only thing I can say is that in Bogolyubov's case, in Fischer's case, and in Alekhine's case, I think they did what most people would do. They
Hmm. Yes,
conformed.
yes.
It's the normal human thing to do.
Well, of course, when Fischer would study chess, and he studied chess like nobody before or since. He'd be looking at the game like 12 hours a day. He often had the radio playing in the background, and so in the early 1960s, uh, he heard a voice on the radio, and it was Herbert W. Armstrong, who is the founder of the Worldwide Church of God. And Armstrong had sort of developed this Christian faith, but with a lot of special characteristics to it. One of them was that the observation of the Sabbath. Another thing that was characteristic of it was that Armstrong was fond of prophecies, and particularly prophecies dealing with the end times, and Bobby picked up on this. It filled a void in his life, and he became a member of this Worldwide Church of God. But to my knowledge, I don't believe that he attended any services as such, and didn't have direct formal engagement with the church until after the match in '72. Now, before that, he did tithe some of his winnings from various tournaments to the church, but I don't believe that it was substantial. But after the World
Yeah.
Championship match, he was quoted as saying he gave them a double tithe, and a tithe would have been 10%, so he would have got 20% of whatever he won in Reykjavik, he donated to him. I think
Yeah.
that from the church's perspective, and that is Herbert Armstrong, his son Garner Ted, and there was a guy, Rader, that was very important in the church hierarchy. I think it wasn't so much the money that they received from Fischer that was important. It was the association with him, because here he was the world
Yeah.
champion. And he wasn't just the world champion, he was the world champion at a time in 1972 when it made him like an internationally known figure, the likes of which we haven't really seen before or since in the chess world. And so, Fischer was involved with that church till about the mid '70s, and then he gave an interview with a publication called the Ambassador Report, in which he denounced the church. And essentially he said, that they had taken financial advantage of him, and that some of the prophecies from Herbert had not proven to be true. Personally, I would have been grateful that they didn't come true. I mean, I think there's no need to hasten the end of the planet. But be that as it may, he later had sort of retracted some of that. I'm not quite sure exactly why, but I do know that by the late 1970s, the Worldwide Church of God splintered, and it doesn't exist anymore by that name. There were various entities that came after it. But I think that the most important thing I take away from his involvement with that church is he made a number of friends, really important friends that were not chess players. And that included Claudia and Makaro and her family. And Makaro, she was essentially like his manager throughout much of the '70s until the late 1980s. And she played a very important role for him. Also, I would mention Henry and Sarah Snyder. Henry Snyder, he was an Olympic coach in track and field. He coached Dwight Stones, who won a bronze medal in the high jump. So he's a very well recognized coach. He was also a great power lifter. He had come from Latvia, and Bobby always got along well with Latvian Americans because they respected chess. And so he had, like, Ed Mars Mednis was Latvian American, and Charles Calme was Latvian American. So what I take away from the Worldwide Church of God, Fischer Fischer made many friends, and some of these friends stayed with him to the end of his life, like the Schneiders. And for example, after the loss of his possessions in the storage locker in the late 1990s, and Bob Ellsworth was able to win back some of those possessions in an auction, it was the son of Harry and Sarah Snyder that actually brought those items to Budapest, to Bobby. So I think that, again, this is one of those things where different people can have different takes on it. I think it filled a void for him at a certain point, and it was maybe a better way to fill that void than what replaced it later on, these various conspiracy theories. But it was not it had its challenges, shall we say. But the thing I really take away from it, I think the most important thing for that was Bobby met a lot of people that took care of him and that helped him. And one thing, Bobby was, one of the greatest chess players, if not the greatest to ever play the game, but he wasn't so good on managing the minutia of daily life. And he was greatly helped by having somebody like, help him find an apartment, help him set up a bank account, just the sort of things that we consider like, you just do them, you don't think too much about them. But for him, he didn't really have a lot of experience in those sort of things. And so it was very helpful. Those people did a major mitzvah for him for that.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask you about two things. While I was reading the book, you mentioned that the people who ran the ambassador report
Yes.
were other ex-members of the organization. Did I get that correct?
Yes, you did. Yes.
Okay, so I'm guessing that was a one-time thing. It's not a publication that came out
I think there might
regularly.
have been, possibly there was more than one episode. And of course, what ended up happening was that Fischer agreed to do an interview with some of these people because
Yeah,
there were a lot of people that objected. The state of California ultimately came in and investigated the Worldwide Church of God because, uh, as a nonprofit, as a 501c3, uh, there's certain obligations they had. They were a religious entity, so that also factored into it. But you couldn't, you had to observe certain regulations, and they didn't. And both Herbert and Garner Ted both were uh, implicated in scandals, both
yeah.
financial and personal as well. And I think that was one of the things that Fisher was probably, as these others members were disappointed in their behavior. I mean, they looked up
Yeah.
to these people, and these people let them down.
Yeah, but it's strange that you mentioned how yeah, before I forget, the second thing, when you mentioned Fisher's ability to, find an apartment and open a bank account, as far as I understood before I read the book, and my opinion or the facts haven't changed since, after the 72 match, he was given accommodation by the organization in several different locations.
That
Did I
is
get that?
correct.
Yeah.
But it's
And
but
then
Mhm.
in about 75 he did that interview, or they recorded him, then he retracted it and told them that, sued them, whatever. He
Mhm.
wasn't. Where did he live after that?
Okay, well, this is a very good question. I gave a talk recently at the San Gabriel Chess Club outside of Los Angeles, and I got to meet for the first time Sarah Snyder and
Hmm.
her son, and we talked about it. And even for them, it's kind of a little difficult to provide a chronology, but I'll try. My
Okay.
impression is that uh, from 72, uh, in Pasadena, California, where the Worldwide Church of God was based, uh, Fisher was given some accommodations, and he lived there for a while, both on the campus and maybe in close proximity. Now, one might presume that after he gave that interview, that he would have been asked to leave. But it's a little complicated because the U.S. Championship was played in Pasadena at Ambassador College in 1978. And I'm guessing that uh, that venue had been selected a couple years prior. And, you know, that, maybe in 78, the church was starting to have difficulties and they wouldn't have undertaken such a obligation, but they did. And Isaac Cashton, for example, was the tournament director. And in some ways, what it's best known for is the fact that Walter Brown, who had won a number of U.S. championships before that, he objected to the lighting in the event and refused to play. But that was also the last time that a lot of Bobby's close friends saw him. And because they
Yeah.
participated in U.S. championship. And that would be like, for example, Bernard Zuckerman. And there was Dr. Anthony Sadie did not play in the event, but he visited the event and he saw Fischer there. And both those individuals had been very close with Bobby when he lived in New York, and Sadie had been close with him when he had relocated to California in late 1960s. But it was in 1978 they could both point to that event as like the last time they saw Fischer. And both of them gave the impression that if he didn't live on the campus, he lived nearby. So let's say up until the late 70s, he was based in Pasadena. After that, all appearances suggest that he lived at the home of Arthur and Claudia Maccaro. And he had met them from the Worldwide Church of God. And we definitely know that he lived there on San Remo. And the reason we know that is for a couple reasons. One, he had some court depositions, and I researched those in Los Angeles in the county courthouse that listed that as like his address. I guess they didn't allow him to list a PO. He had to actually list a formal address. Now, it's possible, of course, that he just listed that address as a formality, that he didn't in fact live at it, but he needed a physical address to give. But I don't think that was the case, because at the Worldwide Chess Hall of Fame, they have a number of Fischer books, and one of them is a chess informant that he dedicated to Kevin Maccaro, who is the son of Arthur and Claudia. So that starts to make it more interesting. And also just there were, she was always the person that people would go to if they wanted to get in contact with Bobby. So for a variety of reasons, I think it likely that he lived with them. And I was told, and it makes sense, that by 1987, his, her basically having to be kind of his full-time manager was starting to put a strain on the Maccaro family. So they relocated to Texas around 1987. And then Bobby, it would appear, moved back to Los Angeles proper from Pasadena, and he lived not too far from Fairfax and Wilshire, which is not too far from downtown Los Angeles. And the reason why I think that's the case is that there was a Geraldo Rivera. He's like an investigative reporter in the United States and kind of a sensationalist one, but still, they mentioned tracking him down to a certain home that was located on, I think it was like on Orange Street, which is close to Wilshire, which is a main artery in LA. And there's a lot to suggest that was where he lived. And I walked to that street. It was a nice street. It had a lot of trees on it. He had a small apartment there, and it would have provided him close proximity to the Los Angeles Public Library, which he liked to visit. It would have been a direct bus shot for him along Wilshire. Also, there were a lot of places on Fairfax, a lot of Jewish eateries like Cantor's that he enjoyed that would have been, within easy walking distance for him. So I think that's at this moment in time, that's sort of my working, my best guess. I wouldn't swear 100% on it, but I think that between living on Ambassador College, then living with the Maccaros, and then living in LA on like Fairfax and Wilshire in that general area, I think that's where he was. And I think that's important because it suggests he always had a place to live, that he was never, unhoused. He was never, living rough. He always had a decent place to live, and he had food. I mean, he might have been, he probably definitely needed help from friends, but he wasn't, indigent.
Yeah, I always find that part of his life most interesting, but unfortunately, all commercial movies and most books end with 72. Some will briefly mention 92, but very, very scarce information in between. And I always wondered how he was able to afford living anywhere. You said he must have had help from friends. Do you think he might have been able to live off the royalties from his books? Is
Well,
that
uh,
possible?
before addressing that, I should also add that there were times when he wasn't in Southern California, as well. He made two visits in around 1981 to Northern California. His sister Joan was based in there with her family. And he also visited and stayed with Peter Biasis and his wife. He also stayed a different time with Jim Buff, for like multiple months. Uh,
Yeah.
but he also, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, he moved to Europe for a while. He was, living in Germany. Uh, Petra Dautov writes about this in her book. And he stayed with Michael Bezel, the Grandmaster, although he wasn't a Grandmaster at that time. He was a youngster, and his father in Germany. So there were times when he wasn't in California. That's important to note. But I think in question to one source of income for him was, Bobby Fischer teaches chess. He should have gotten some royalties for that, and some royalties for uh, uh, my 60 Memorable Games. And I know that Shanaz Kennedy, who has a new book coming out soon with New in Chess, who befriended him in the early 80s, she was sometimes the go-between, because it wasn't always easy to find like the right address to send the money to Bobby, but she had contact with him and could facilitate that. And that was really important for him. And uh, his mother also, she received a Social Security check, and I think uh, at least for some of the time, that money was sent directly to Bobby. The money she received probably was a relatively small amount, but it probably helped as well. And the other thing I think that really helped was the fact that Fischer was not very materialistic. He, especially in those years, just probably having a roof over his head and, some food in his stomach and books to read. That was, those were the things, that kept him going. And, you know, they're not that expensive.
I remember reading that when he said that out of all the money he'd won over the years, he only spent someone uh, a lot of $400 suits. That's the one
Yes,
thing I remember
I
from
think
the book.
I think that was more when he was younger, uh, uh, because certainly when he played the match in 1992, and he required a new wardrobe. Uh, there's a book by Stankovic, who was his sort of man Friday that kind of looked after him when he was in the former Yugoslavia. And Stankovic writes about, Fischer had a lot of clothing that was of high quality, but it was, like 30 years old or 20 years old and needed to be replaced. And also, Fischer had gotten physically larger, so it's
Yeah.
quite possible that some of the clothing that he had when he was younger, like in 72, he was very fit. Well, in 1992, I mean, it was like, 20 years had passed, and well, as happens to many folks, I mean, he was a little bit larger than he was before.
Yeah. But I also want to talk about uh, what happened between 72 and 75. And usually my understanding is of that period is very superficial, and I don't know much. And in your book, I read his letter to the FIDE officials for the first time, the entire letter, where he sends his suggestions or requests. They all sounded extremely reasonable to me personally, and if I were given, the authority to decide, I wouldn't know why or why I should object to any of them. So apart from those requests and his inability to conform with the official rules and the way chess was organized, uh, what else was the reason that he didn't play? And the events in between his winning the 72 championship and not defending the title, how would you sort them in order? Because I'm still extremely confused with that.
Well, first off, remember that what Fischer was really asking for was return to the conditions that, for example, Steinitz and Lasker played world championship matches under. And when he played the match in 72, uh, the challenger, which was Fischer at the time, he had to win the match by one game. If the
Yeah.
match finished in a tie, as a number of world champion matches before that had ended, then the title would have been retained by the champion. The difference, as I understand it, is that in this particular condition, I think the champion, the challenger had to win by two, I believe. So essentially what you saw was the match in 78 in Baguio that went so long, and the match in 84 between Karpov and
Yeah.
uh, Kasparov that went even longer and ultimately wasn't completed. That match, uh, uh, those two matches, they followed all the conditions of Fischer in that draws didn't count, but
Yeah.
they didn't require the challenger to win by two. I could be wrong about that, but that's my understanding of it. But I think that really what you have to do when you think about Fischer is you have to take a step back and take a look at, for example, the Seuss Interzonal in 1967. Fischer, I believe, I want to say he had like 8.5 out of 10. There was still, the tournament was only roughly at the halfway point. So, nothing was absolutely 100% guaranteed, but the odds that he was going to qualify for the candidates, probably was going to win the event, but he certainly was going to qualify for the candidates. And yet he withdrew from the event. He withdrew from it. And I think that's a very important episode in his career because obviously he wanted to be world champion and he was taking the first step in that direction. And yet he withdrew. Now he withdrew as a matter of principle over the conditions. But what it tells me is that it was very easy for him to go off the wheels, if you will. And for example, in 1972, I would say that if I were a prognosticator and I was setting the odds for the match actually taking place, I would not have made it more than like 50-50. Now that might seem a little strange considering he had already beaten Tamanov, he'd beaten Larson, he'd beaten Petrosian. He'd gotten so close to his goal and he felt confident that he could win the individual match for reasons that were objective. They weren't just, rah, rah, I think I'm going to win. But he felt he was just playing much better in 1972 than Spassky was, which in fact that was the case. But remember that just a few days before the match, he was in Los Angeles. Now, it took Anthony Sadie to get him to New York. And it was very fortuitous that once Sadie had this long relationship, which dated back to the mid-1950s, and it was a relationship that included not just Bobby, but other members of the Fischer family. For example, Sadie had dated Bobby's sister, Joan, and Regina had asked Sadie, for example, for the Zurich 59 tournament, Sadie went there as Bobby's chaperone because he was still, he was 16 years old. He was a minor. So Sadie casually mentioned to Fischer that he was going to be going to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles to New York to visit his family. And, he asked me, hey, Bobby, would you like to come along? And just in a very non-threatening, non-confrontational manner, Bobby said, yeah, that's not a bad idea. I'd like to see your family. So he flew to New York. And then the plan initially was for Fischer to go on to Reykjavik. But that didn't happen. Fischer kind of got spooked by all the press at the airport, and he ended up going with Sadie to the Sadie family home in Douglaston on Long Island. And Fischer felt very much at home there because he had vacationed with the Sadie family in Martha's Vineyard in 1956. He knew Sadie's mother. He knew she was a great cook. I mean, Bobby always loved to eat. He was around friends there and felt comfortable. And then ultimately he kind of got his bearings, and then he went on to Reykjavik. But if it hadn't been for Sadie in that example, or if it hadn't been for all the Herculean efforts by Ed Edmondson prior to that, I don't think that that match would have ever come off. Fischer would never have made it through all the world championship cycle. I mean, for example, at Edmondson, when Fischer was playing in the interzonal in 1970 in Palma, uh, Edmondson was always in the auditorium and always near the doorway into the playing hall, because he made sure nobody banged the door. Because Fischer, one of the things that's special about Fischer is that he had exceptionally acute hearing. You know, he must have gotten like more dog DNA than the usual human being in their genetic makeup, because he had incredibly sensitive hearing. And sometimes people thought he was really picky about noise and stuff, but he could hear things they couldn't. And so Edmondson was always looking out for Bobby and always trying to make sure that the conditions would be the best possible for him. And so, in summary, I think the odds that the 75 match were going to happen. I think that Bobby intended to be a playing world champion, as he said, and that he would play in tournaments and he would defend his title, all that. I think one part of his brain always intended for that to be the case, but there was some other part of him that was just, that worked against that.
So are you saying that that part, could have changed history prior to 72, if I got you correctly, but that
Yeah.
after 72 and in between 72 and 75, there weren't any fortunate incidents that made him play, as was the case with Sadie in 72. So
Right. Well,
yeah.
I can say that Edmondson went to the FIDE Congress, and he strongly pushed forward Fischer's demands and did it very effectively. And the vote was very, very close in FIDE. But of course, the Soviets, they've always, or now today Russia, for example, have always been very influential in FIDE. I mean, if you look at the a number of people that have been a FIDE president, well, in this century, I think it's just Ilim Zhinov and, Ilim Zhinov. I think Makarov might have been president for a year, maybe in 94, and then Ilim Zhinov immediately after that. And then, of course, today we have Dvorkovich. Chess is very important in the Soviet Union. It's very important in Russia today. That country, or if you want to speak of the Soviet Union and Russia, they're not exactly the same, but both of them put a high value on sports, and in Russia today, I mean, they're not warmly welcomed in a lot of international sporting bodies. So having Dvorkovich as the president of FIDE is a very important thing. I mean, if, for example, an American were to become president of FIDE, it would mean nothing to, like, for example, President Trump, zero.
Yeah.
But for Putin, it's a different situation. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the Russians really pulled out all the stops. They suffered a major embarrassment in 72, and I think I just don't really see a way that that Bobby's I don't know if you want to call them his requests or his demands would have ever actually happened. And you can go back to, for example, the match between Lasker and Schlechter, which Schlechter was leading with one game to go. And there have always been questions about why Schlechter didn't play more safely in the last game. And, he would just, and one piece of analysis is that, the 2-game win by the challenger was an effect. that that Schlechter had to win the last game if he actually wanted to win the match. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, and I can't speak. I know that there's arguments on both sides, but certainly, some of the world championship matches that have been played in the past have been played with that, that condition that the challenger had to win by two.
What about the okay? So the way I imagine the chess world after Fischer won won the title in '72 is that, as is known, he's a superstar. Everyone knows him, not just chess players. Everyone knows him. So if I were uh, an organizer or a chess promoter, or if I owned, a casino or a hotel in Monte Carlo or in wherever, I'd be thinking, okay, Fischer won the championship. Let's organize a tournament. Let's invite him. He wants a lot of money. He wants good conditions. Let's give him everything. Let's just, get him to play. And we will invite Spassky. We will invite whoever's strongest at the time to create a spectacle and to, do that for promotional purposes. How come that never happened? I find it inexplicable that no one rich who knew enough about chess to understand how famous Fischer was didn't think, okay, let's give him whatever he wants. Let's just get him to play. And not in '75, but in late '72. How
Well,
come?
I would say first off, I think there's possibly a couple different reasons. One, I would say, is that Fischer had been involved in the World Championship cycle since 1958, and much like Spassky, who played his first candidates in '55 but didn't become champion until '69, it was a long road for Fischer. Making it to the top 10 is one thing. Becoming world champion is quite something different. And so it was a very long road for Fischer. So I think, you know, oftentimes when people become world champion, some of the motivation that drove them to achieving the title isn't, they feel like, they summited Everest. They don't, what else, there's nothing left to prove. So there's that aspect to it. But I think there were a lot of attractive financial offers for Fischer, you know, in the early to mid '70s. Maybe say '73 to like '78, because he was negotiating with Karpov for a possible match outside of FIDE. I don't ever see that. I don't see how that could happen. I don't see how the Soviet Union would have allowed that to happen. Uh, but uh, I think that in Fischer's case, there had to be a sufficient motivation for him to come back. And only in 1992 was there. And essentially what it was Zita Rajani, and she, Bobby was at a point in his life when he was in his late 40s where he wanted to become married. He wanted to start a family. That was very important to him. And he thought he'd been working on that possibility for a couple of years before, for example, with Petra Dautov. But ultimately, uh, you know, the situation with Zita, he realized that maybe there was a chance there, and if he wanted to happen, he was going to need some money. He couldn't start a family and get married with the sort of financial resources that he had unless he returned to the arena. And so I think that 1992 was kind of a perfect storm, because there was like a motivation for him, and also there was, I think that having Gligerich around was really, really critical. Gligerich is like, one of my chess heroes. I got to play him 3 times, and it was always a real honor to play against him. The last time was first time was in, I think, I played him in Lone Pine, I played him in Lugano, and then I played him in Vancouver in the early 2000s. And he was there with his good friend Boryevkov. So it was very, very nice to see them. And he was like one of the great gentlemen of chess. And
Yeah. I
also one
think
of the
of
good
him as
players.
James Bond. He is the James Bond
Yes.
of chess in my mind.
Yeah, well, he was a very good athlete. He was a very good writer. He was very personable, and he was a great player. I mean, what was there not that he checked every box, and he was a good friend of Bobby since the interzonal in Porto Roche when they first met, And he was kind of, the age difference was such that he was almost kind of like a father figure, or say like an uncle or older brother. And Fischer, they kept in touch all the way to 78 or 79. They were in close communication. And then Fischer kind of went through that period where, even people like Gligerich and Benko were cut out. But when he came back in the early 90s, one of the first people he wrote to was Gligerich. And I should say that Gligerich ran for FIDE president, and one of his motivations in doing so was to get Fischer to return to the arena, to set the conditions that would allow for him to play again. Uh, he would have been a great FIDE president, but he was not really a politician, so I don't think that was really going to ever happen, unfortunately. Although he did respectably in the vote count. Uh, so uh, you know, it's, I think when you look at Fischer and you look at the, uh, the events that transpired in his life, that 92 match, it was the motivation with Zita. Uh, it was also the presence of Gligerich, a person there to help him through it. Also having Eugenio Torre, who was a good friend, as his second. And also, Bobby really loved Yugoslavia. I could have easily imagined him living in Yugoslavia. You know, I think even more than Argentina, he Yugoslavia was his second home, if you will. And I think that part of that was the respect that the people of Yugoslavia gave to chess. Even like the average person would know something, would have some basic chess culture, if you will. And Fischer had played a number of tournaments there, starting with the interzonal in 58, the candidates in 59, Bled in 61. He played all over in the former Yugoslavia, and I think he either played or he gave simuls in like all six of the republics. And so he was no stranger. And he also he spoke pretty decent Serbo-Croatian, is my understanding. When he played the match with Taimanov in Vancouver in 1971, uh, they analyzed the games together after the match. And Taimanov did not speak English, or very poorly, and Fischer didn't speak German. Uh, I think Fischer's understanding of written Russian was excellent, but his ability to speak it wasn't that precise. He never lived in the country. He'd never made any extended stays, except for that one visit in 58. He was never there. Uh, but the situation was much different with Yugoslavia. I think he picked up the language. He had a good feel for language, and so he picked up Serbo-Croatian fairly quickly and communicated in it. And so I think that was just another little, he felt at home playing in Belgrade and Sveti Stefan. And so all those things, it was kind of a perfect storm it came to be. But the main one, if you ask me, just to pick up one, it had to be Zita.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with you, I think. So do you think had he met a girl he liked 19 years before 92, had he been offered enough money and he had to earn it to raise a family, do you think he would have accepted the match in 73?
Well, that's a tricky one to say, because even after giving the double tithe to uh, uh, the Ambassador College, to the Worldwide Church of God, he still must have had like, pretty good money in those days, because the prize fund in Reykjavik was record setting for its time. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, you know, $100,000 then, for example, would be, I don't know. I mean,
A
it would
million
be
at least?
over half $1 million for certain.
Yeah.
And yeah, for certain. So, and remember, he was not a person that had huge material needs. So, it's possible. I know that they did arrange some dates for him with some of the women that were uh, associated with the college, but uh, I don't know that he got particularly close to anybody. I mean, uh, but I don't know any precise details
Yeah.
as far as that goes.
I mean, that part of his life is very interesting to me. I actually got to play Zita Raichani's current husband, or might be ex-husband today. I was
Mhm.
playing in a tournament in uh, close to the Hungarian border in Serbia, and I don't think I should talk about that, but that period of his life is very interesting. And I wanted to ask you about one thing that I'd never heard of before reading the book. His accusations against Kasparov, and in particular against his annotations. I found those remarkable. I mean, that was early 90s already, I think,
Yes.
maybe late 80s. Uh, so he claimed two things. Firstly, that Kasparov arranged games, which I don't know if that's true. I don't think it is, but it's clear that the Soviets had been arranging games for at least 40 years at that point, because there are clear facts about Bronstein-Botvinnik in 1951, that Bronstein won the final match against, my brain
Boslavsky.
doesn't work. Yeah, against
Boslavsky.
Boleslavsky by drawing or winning the final game by agreement, and Weinstein supposedly arranged all of that. And since then, I'm sure there must have been many arranged games and scores, especially in tournaments confined to the Soviet Union. So it's plausible that Kasparov had arranged games at some point. Whether it's provable, I don't know. But the other thing about his analysis is definitely true, as is the case with his refutations of Keres analysis and other players. What do you think about that? What do you think about his stance on Kasparov?
Okay, well, the first thing I would say is that you recall that Gary wrote a book for Batsford, Batsford chess openings.
Yeah.
And that was very early in his career, and relatively, like mid 80s or so, I would say. And at that point, uh, you know, Gary was not nearly as savvy as he is today. And so he, I believe, likely got roped into like a multi-book deal. And I think I remember there was a book that he did with Nikitin on the Cairo Khan, or maybe it was on the there was a Cairo Khan book. There was also one with on the maybe on the Shevenigan, but there were some opening monographs that came out, and then there was this book that Fischer draws the analysis from, and there's no question that the analysis that was presented under his name is really sloppy.
Yeah.
No question at all. It's mistake ridden. But I suspect what happened is that Gary's involvement was minimal in that book,
Yeah.
and I don't think that he actually wrote those things. Now, they did appear under his name, but it kind of might have been like, he was like a singer that was signed up to do like several albums by some company, and they kind of were getting ready to part ways, and the company remembered, hey, you still owe us one more album, and it's not a 100% effort. And so I think that Bobby was right. Bobby would never allow a book to be published under his name that the analysis wasn't, something that he could live with. Okay, so there's that aspect to it. Uh, as far as the allegations of cheating, I think that it's
Well, not
useful to take.
cheating, but match fixing. Or
Okay, all right. Well, yeah. See, words are probably important in this context. So, for example, Fischer felt that what the Soviets did, and by the way, Fischer never referred to them as the Soviets. He always referred to them as the Russians, which is
yeah,
rather a funny thing because, you have like, Keres is Estonian, Petrosian's Armenian,
yeah,
Tal's Latvian, but you're right. I'll just refer to them as the Soviets because it sounds too funny. So Bobby, he felt that what happened in Curacao was a form of cheating. And to put it in context, Keres, Petrosian, and Geller made a pact, and they were not like, teenagers, and they were going to play, uh, uh, I think it was like a quadruple round robin amongst 8 participants. Yeah, 28 games. Okay. A lot of chess. It turned out to be a little less because Tall fell ill in the tournament, but still a very long event that went over a month. And it was going to be played in the, not too far from Venezuela in the Dutch Antilles. And the three of them thought, we're going to be playing like in this tropical heat for like over a month in this marathon event. It makes sense to make some strategic short draws and then use all of our energies against our competition. Now, Fischer thought that Korchnoi was part of this deal, but clearly he wasn't if you look at the record in the tournament. It was not all the participants, it was just these three, which suggests it wasn't a decision by the Soviet Chess Federation. It was an individual decision amongst these three outstanding players. So, well, on the one hand, you're not supposed to prearrange draws. So there's that side of it, okay? But to be fair, if Fischer were winning, if Fischer had gotten off to a really excellent start, those guys would have probably have to change their program, because otherwise he would just run away from them. So there's that, so there's different ways to look at that one. Of course, after Curacao, the candidates were such that they went from playing a tournament for the candidates to playing individual matches. Also, events like the interzonals, Fischer and others decided, that it was not a good idea to have the Soviets playing each other at the end of the tournament, where you might have a situation where one player has a chance to qualify and another player doesn't. And I think that probably in some ways the Soviet players, they also preferred to play earlier in the event, because imagine you're in the last round and you're playing in that situation and you're the player that has no chance to advance. And if you lose the game, everybody will think that you dumped the game, and you're no matter what you do, you're going to probably be damned. So, so I think that was definitely the right start. Now, the one bad part of that was that in interzonals, there would be this part of the tournament where players would have to play against 5 or 6 Soviets in a row, so it was a really tough stretch of rounds to have to play. So, Fischer, he also felt that, for example, throughout the history of the World Championship up to Reykjavik, and then even after Reykjavik, there was often the case where a player would lose a game with black, and then in the very next game they would play super solid with white. For example, Petrosian was always of the feeling that even if you have the white pieces in your hands after a loss, you have to make yourself whole again. You don't play for a win in the next game. You just play to get on the scoreboard, to reestablish your equilibrium, and then you go forward. Certainly the players today, they don't live by this code, but but there was a time when people like Petrosian did this. And so in the World Championship matches, it was very common for a draw to be made in the game after decisive result. And Fischer would never do this. He would never waste the white pieces like this. And I would say that there doesn't necessarily have to be a prior arrangement between the two contestants that this game's going to be a draw, but I think there could be kind of an understanding, by the opening choice by white, if it's particularly quiet, that black would not be insulting white by offering a draw after 20 moves, for example. And if you look at the match, the super long one, the first one between Kasparov and Karpov, there was huge number of short draws, okay? But Kasparov was just hanging on by his toenails. He was down 5-0. I mean, just one push and he would have been pushed off the cliff. So, I wouldn't fault him for that. And I'm sure in retrospect, Karpov wishes he had been more ambitious in some of those games after he got that lead. But it's hard to call that cheating. And also, another thing that would oftentimes happen is after a player lost in a World Championship match, they would take a timeout. They would say they were sick. they would get a note from the doctor and say, I'm excused, I'm not going to play the next game. And Fischer was really against that. He thought that was like an insult. Like there could be like fans that came to watch the next game. They traveled from a long distance. I mean, when was the last time you saw an NBA game where like, the players on both sides say, oh, my toenail's hurting me. I can't play this next game. Our whole team is going to sit out that game. No, not going to happen. So Fischer never took a timeout in that whole world championship cycle. And clearly the first half of the match against Petrosian, he was suffering from a pretty serious cold. But his feeling was, unless he was like put in the hospital, as long as he could like walk to the board and sit down and play, he should play. Now it's true that he did have one short draw, the Maroczy Bind game where Petrosian was white, but he was black against Petrosian, and by that choosing that opening choice, which Fischer had played before, there really wasn't a lot that he could do to avoid the draw. I mean, it was pretty much, it was going to happen. So all those things are all, can you say that they're not seen so much today, by the way. If there are accusations of like cheating, it's usually more with computer assistance. These sort of issues are really not so much in play. Now, what I would say is that if you look at Kasparov's career, for example, there was a game with Judith Polgar where he touched a piece and he moved another. Well, that doesn't really quite describe the situation because it happened like in a millisecond, and it wasn't really clear if he had done it or not. And I would say with Kasparov, I don't think that the accusations of cheating, I can't really think of like him throwing games or fixing games. I don't really see that. What I see more with Kasparov is sometimes he's very emotional and he'll do something and then have to walk it back. But I don't see that aspect. Now with Karpov, it's a different situation. He won a number of tournaments where he was world champion, where he had to beat a compatriot in the last round, and he never failed to do so. There was also, he played in the World Rapid Championship, the first one, I think it was held in Mazatlan in Mexico. And there was a game, and I don't know if it was, I think it was with Gavrikov. It could have been with Yudasin, but there was one of the players he played that was a Soviet, and he lost the game. And then after the game was over, there was a protest lodged, like there was some technical issue, but it was very, very dodgy. And so I think with him, Bobby might have been on more solid ground. Now, of course, what he said is that Kasparov and Karpov prearranged their games. And he had some ways he was going to try to show it, but I've never really been a big buyer into that theory. I don't really see how that would have worked out. Yeah, I don't think so.
I found that episode very interesting because it was the first time reading about that. Let's get to before this gets too long, the first part of the book very briefly. I've also never read in as much detail about his early career and his the guys that were his age that were good players from all over the U.S. and in the 55 and 56 and I forget the years and locations, but in the first Opens and Junior Championships, the players he played, I thought it was great that you basically wrote mini books on each of them. I really enjoyed them. Usually, when you go to chessgames.com or when you read the Fischer book, you see Fischer against almost NN, those guys that played him in 55, 56. I found it refreshing that you gave the readers background and context, and you explained which players among them became strong, which were stronger than Fischer at the time, because you don't get, when you put things into perspective, that Fischer was, 1700, 1800, and he was playing, again, I forgot his name. What's the kid from California who was better than Fischer in 56?
Gary Remlinger.
Yes. When you see them, not face to face, but in the same tournament, and it's hard to understand that Fischer was the underdog.
Yes.
So, yeah. No,
Well,
yeah, go ahead. It was
okay.
refreshing to get that perspective.
Right. I think the thing with Fischer is that, usually people remember the game of the century that he played against
Yeah,
Donald Byrne, and they think of Fischer as like this great prodigy, and, along the lines of, Capablanca or Reshevsky or Pomar. Uh, and he was, but he wasn't but not in the sense that they were, okay? Because uh, we have players that achieved the grandmaster title at the age of 12 now, I guess.
yeah,
And certainly, if you want to be a world class player, one of the very elite, it's expected you become a grandmaster by the age of at least 15. Well, in Fischer's case, when he was 12 years old, he was not an outstanding player by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, recently there was an article on him by Grandmaster Gregory Serper at chess.com, and Serper basically said this guy was incredibly weak. He was overrated at 1700, and he shows Fischer playing like e4 or e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight c3. So he's playing like this kind of beginner's opening, that allows knight takes e4. He's playing that in 1955, and that same player in approximately 3 years is one of the top 10 players in the world.
yeah,
So how is this possible?
yeah,
It's kind of mind-boggling. Bobby's explanation for it, he had a very simple one. He said, "I just got good." But I think that is kind of a oversimplification, because in the case of Fischer, what you saw was, he was taught the game by his sister when he was like about 6 years old, so it's 1949. And 51, his mother writes to Herman Helms and gets the famous response, take your young son to the Brooklyn Public Library for the simul. And that's his introduction to organized chess. Before that, he just played amongst his friends. But now he's like in a real chess environment. And more importantly than playing in the simul was meeting Carmine Nigro. And Nigro was expert strength player, a player that learned to play during the Second World War, like a lot of American servicemen did. And he was self-taught player. He learned from books, and he was at that simul. And his son was a young chess player, and so he invited Bobby to join their little group. And today, I mean, scholastic chess is incredibly well developed, but that was not the case in 1951. And it turned out most of the kids at Nigro's classes, after 1 hour, they just wanted to go and run around and play sports and stuff. But there was this one kid that didn't, that really wanted to study chess. And that was Bobby, of course. And Nigro had some funny ideas about how to learn chess. Essentially, he was a book learner, and the books that were available in English were few and far between, but the best ones were by Reuben Fine. And one of the books was called Practical Chess Openings, which was somewhat similar to the better known modern chess openings. And it was essentially like a opening book with main lines listed and then footnotes with all the deviations. And at some point, Nigro just said, we're going to go through this book from the beginning until the end. Not exactly the kind of method of study that would be employed today. But, as Korchnoi once said, any sort of chess study is good chess study. You'll learn something from no matter what you do, as long as you move the pieces. Well, in Fischer's case, he did learn, things, but his development was very slow. Between 51 and the summer of 1956, he was, by that point in the summer of 56, he was maybe about 2100. And it's tricky to know exactly what his true strength was, because the ratings only came out once a year, with a result that, by the end of the year, the guy could be like several hundred points stronger. But if you use those ratings and you also look at the individual games, you can get kind of a picture. And the Fischer that played in the U.S. Amateur in the summer and May Memorial Day weekend of 56, he scored like 4.5 points out of 6. And this was an event for only players up to 2,200. So I would say a rating of about 2,100 would be appropriate for that. Well, everything changed in the summer of 56 because Nigro was no longer stronger than Bobby as a player. So it was a natural time to sort of shift, I mean, sometimes you'll have players that work with coaches that are weaker than them in rating. But it's not always, especially at that age and that rating, it wouldn't be too typical. So what happened was Nigro was going to go to Florida. And at that Memorial Day weekend tournament, Bobby was introduced to Jack Collins. And Collins was like one of the top roughly 15 players in the country. And he was a very well-known correspondence player. He wrote a column in Chess Life. He suffered from some physical challenges, but mentally he was a very, very bright person and a very warm and friendly person. He lived only a mile from Bobby. So this was a very, very fortuitous event that they met, and that he invited Bobby basically to come to his club. It was called the Hawthorne Chess Club. He lived at that point on Lenox Road, but the club had gotten its name from a prior location, and the club was essentially his apartment, which he shared with his sister Ethel. And for the better part of the next 2 years, Fischer lived in their home as much as he spent time anywhere else. So Erasmus High School was just around the corner from where Collins lived. Fischer would go to school. Lunch break, he would go off campus, spend the hour with Collins looking at chess and having lunch. He would return to school for several hours and then immediately go back to Collins' home. And then from like roughly 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock every afternoon and evening, he would be at the Collins home. De facto, Collins and his sister Ethel were like his family. And then Bobby's mother, who worked as a nurse, she would get off her shift around 9 in the evening and take Bobby home, and he would sleep, and then off to school and then back on the program. And Collins' home was really, his club, the Hawthorne, was the perfect place for Bobby for those days because he had a huge library. I mentioned that the number of books in English was relatively limited at the time, but Collins had books in all sorts of languages. For example, the book, the 4-volume series on Steinitz by Bachmann was a prized possession of Collins, and Fischer could, use whatever books were there and he just read through all of it. And he played a lot of training games with Collins, and Collins could still play very competitively with Fischer, even in 1958, when on the eve of Fischer going to Europe, ultimately to go for the interzonal, they played a training game where Collins beat him on the black side of Roy Lopez. So he was not a weak player, as William Lombardi gave the impression in his book. He was actually a very decent player, and I think his understanding of chess might have been even higher than his rating because, he was a very diminished stature, but he also had he had a birth defect that made it impossible for him to walk as an adult. And I could imagine that his stamina for like a long tournament game was not ideal, but his understanding of the game was first rate. And it wasn't just Collins; other strong players were coming over there all the time. And it wasn't just like strong players to play 10 second a move chess, maybe to analyze different positions, to consult the library. But for example, there was players like Helms, and there was another player too, whose name escapes me at the moment, who knew Steinitz personally back in the day, back in the 1890s. So, it must have been a very inspirational environment for Bobby. And I just think that when you have like a young player like that, and you put him in that sort of environment where they're just totally immersed in chess, they're going to improve, and they're going to improve quickly. And when they have the talent that Bobby did, and you mix that together, then you see this, this special accelerant that transformed him from, a 1700 player to a 2600 player in, 3 years.
It did, yeah. The story of his early development is fascinating. I, I I'm I want to finish by asking you two questions. One of them might be tough. The first one is simple. What's your favorite Fischer game? Do you have a favorite?
That's really tricky. Uh, there's so many games of his that I really like. I mean, of course, the game he played against Petrosian, where he traded off the good knight, if you will, against the, in parentheses, bad bishop.
Bad Bishop.
It's a classic example of how Fischer, like played in this Capablanca-like style. Now, you can find earlier examples. Like I remember there was a Rubinstein game where he did something similar like that. But of all the players Fischer ever referenced, I don't think I ever heard him mention the name of Rubinstein ever. He wasn't a world champion, but he was about as close as you could get. But I don't know if he and Fischer ever, if Fischer ever played over a lot of his games. Really not sure, but maybe that would be one. Also, another game, if I could ask Fischer a question, would be, he was really noted for his mastery of the King's Indian attack. And when he was young, uh, he segued and played. He started off when he was like, probably 51 to 55. He was playing e4 as white, but in a very primitive fashion, shall we say. And then at a certain point, he was playing the King's Indian defense, and so he started playing the King's Indian attack. And he did that for, even up to when he won his first US championship in late 57, early 58. He was still occasionally playing the, knight f3, g3 on the opening moves. But then that went away. He realized he needed more adult openings, if you will. But then sometime in the mid 1960s, like around 67 or so, he
Yeah,
realized,
Marsuren.
yes, he realized that the King's Indian attack could still be a useful tool if Black had committed to playing e6. So all of a sudden he was playing against e4, e6 against the French, and after e4, c5, knight f3, e6, he might play like d3 there as well. And he won many famous games on both sides. So the game with Masurin played in the Seuss Interzonal, that game he played that early a3 on about the 12th move. And clearly the idea behind it was Black was threatening to play a5, a4, a3, force White to play b3, and then secure the c3 square for the knight. To have a knight like on the 5th or 6th rank, would be, really a accomplishment for Black. But Fischer played a3 there, and he even played it before Black had played a4. I think the Black pawn was still maybe on a5 in that position. And the question is, what made him do it? Because the traditional positional rule is you play when there's an attack on two flanks, you play on the side where you're stronger and don't touch the other side. And the rationale is that if you do move anything on the queen side in that position for White who's attacking on the king side, you'll just accelerate your opponent's counterplay. You'll make it easier for him to open lines and to get his pieces more active on that side. And yet Fischer understood that, when you play against a strong player, it's very seldom that you can sort of totally impose your will on them. You can't just get everything you want and give nothing in return. You have to be a trader and exchange goods, but in such a way that's advantageous to you. And so Fischer realized that although his move might help Black's queenside play, it would actually slow it down slightly, and he would gain more time to develop his kingside attack. Well, he played a game earlier in 1963 in the Western Open in Bay City, Michigan, against Bisgeier. A game,
Yeah.
yes, and that game's probably most famous for the fact that at some point during the game, Bisgeier is alleged to have to woken him up because it was a resort. There wasn't not much going on. And the night before, Fischer had been playing blitz with Norbert Leopoldi the whole night, an expert from Chicago, probably giving both time and money odds. But at the end of the night, Fischer had this big pile of lucre on his side of the table, but he had no sleep. And so he supposedly played this game with Bisgeier, half awake. And at a certain point, Bisgeier had this this decision to make whether to wake him up or not. But knowing Arthur, it was probably a very easy one. He's always very friendly and amiable guy. Even though he lost all these games to Fischer, he'd never want to win by Fischer losing on time because he was sleeping. So I'm sure if the story is true, he immediately woke him up. And at a certain point in that game, White played a4, a5, and it was a King's Indian, but a funny King's Indian where White had played the move e3 instead of e4, allowing Black to play e5 and e4. So in essence, you had a King's Indian attack with colors reversed. And in the position where White plays a5, it's pretty obvious that Black has to play a6 because the positional threat of playing a6 is so powerful that it has to stop it. But still, I wonder if that registered in Fischer's thinking, because when he annotated the game for Boy's Life, he said he spent 15 minutes deciding whether to play a3 or not. And for Fischer, spending 15 minutes, that was a huge amount of time, just huge. He almost, there are very few instances in his career where he've gone into such a deep thought. And also, it's kind of a funny position because it's, sometimes you're playing in a chess game and you can calculate a fairly forced sequence for a considerable amount of moves. Maybe there's no pawn captures, it's all piece maneuvers, and it's very clear, and the moves are very forcing, and you can analyze it. But then there's some other positions where it's very hard to calculate. It might be counterproductive because in that position, you're relying more on experience and intuition, and it's very difficult to analyze it move by move. So I would have liked to ask Fischer, like, how did he come up with a3 in that position? And did you think about that earlier game? And did you calculate variations, or how did you come up with it? So that would be so. I'm not quite answered your question, what's my favorite game, but that would be my favorite question, what I would want to ask him.
I'm actually surprised that you chose my favorite game. That his win against McMarson is my favorite, along with his White Hedgehog against Anderson with g4. So yeah, and the second question, if you could find out magically one thing about Fischer that you don't know now, what would it be?
Gosh, there, as a completist, I might say, for example, it seems to me shocking that you have a guy that became one of the greatest players in the world, and that we don't even have one of his tournament games, all the moves to it, and it was played as late as 1963. He played a game against Miro Radojcic. And Radojcic was also like one of these kind of Yugoslav Renaissance men, if you will. He was at least my knowledge is he was a very well-known journalist. He was stationed in London. He was stationed in New York. This is probably a time when a lot of Yugoslavs depended on him for providing them with a perspective of the world. And he was also a very good chess player. He was like a FIDE master strength player, and he had a very aggressive style. Well, he played Bobby in the New York State Open in 1963 in a two-knights defense. And it was one of the two games Bobby played knight h3 in that tournament. The one with Bisgeier made it into 60 memorable games, and the game with Radojcic made it as a fragment into that game. So I'm like, I often wonder, why couldn't somebody at one of the many press conferences, instead of asking Fischer some ridiculous question, why couldn't they say, could you please supply us with the remaining moves of your game with Radojcic? But that might be a little too technical of a thing. I think, with Fischer, I think one question I would have wanted to know more about is how much he knew about his father. And, it wasn't until, I guess, the early 2000s that we learned that Gerhard Fischer was not Bobby Fischer's father, that it was somebody completely different, and somebody that, yes, and had never been mentioned before. And what do we know about that? Well, we know Bobby was born in 1943 in March in Chicago, and we know that in 1942 both Nemenyi and Regina Fischer were in based in Colorado. He was a professor there, and she was a student. Uh, we know that in 1945, Regina was living in Moscow, Idaho, this time. She lived in Moscow in Soviet Union in the 1930s, but here she was in Moscow, Idaho, straddling the border on the Idaho-Washington state line. And he was right across in what is today Washington State University. He was like, some sort of academic work. And so in 45, they're in the same place. In 47, he was stationed on the East Coast outside of Washington, D.C., working for the U.S. Navy in some capacity, physics related. And in 49, Regina moves to New York City. And the family had been in Arizona before that. So the impression is that they had not been in close touch maybe for a couple of years. But in 49, New York City and Washington, D.C., it's a couple hours by train. It's not too far away. In 49, Bobby's 6 years old. I doubt that he would have had memories of Nemenyi earlier in his life, like when he was 2 or 3. But when he's 6, certainly it's possible. Nemenyi died in 1952, I want to say, okay? So there's certainly possibilities that Bobby met him. But I don't know in what context he was presented to Bobby. Like, was he presented to Bobby as his father or his uncle or a family friend? I don't know. Because I think that one of the things with Fischer that you have to consider is, he grew up without a father. Not only did he grow up without a father, but he grew up with somebody else's name on the birth certificate. So it's kind of like, if I were Fischer, I might have asked, like, why did Nemenyi not want to be, associated with me? Was there something wrong with me? I'm not certain, but I think Nemenyi's wife, he had married when he was in Europe, and he had a son, like from the early 1930s. I think his wife died. I don't think she was in the United States. So, obviously that could have been one reason if she was still alive. But I think, not certain of it, that when Bobby was born, that Nemenyi was single. So I can understand maybe they didn't want to get married. And of course, even though Regina was a very free spirit and a very independent-minded person, I think in 1943, the option to leave the father on the birth certificate blank was not an option. I think that, you had to have a name in there. So I often wonder, for Fischer, that maybe he, this, was always kind of like a sore spot for him in his life. And I think another thing to keep in mind is Nemenyi, he was not just a famous, accomplished physicist and mathematician, but he came from a very prominent family in Hungary, a family, that was very prominent going back generations. And if you look online, it suggests also, like they mention, like the family owned works by like Kandinsky and Matisse and obviously they had to have some real resources. Which suggests possibly that Nemenyi had some money, because I know that when he died, Nemenyi's son Peter, his only other child, Bobby's half brother, who was considerably older, there was correspondence between him and Regina, because Regina wondered if some money had been left for Bobby in Nemenyi's will. There's some suggestions that maybe Peter Nemenyi might have had some contact with Bobby. And Nemenyi's other son, Peter, he was also like an accomplished mathematician. He was like a civil rights activist. Also, a very accomplished person in his own right. And, Bobby, he came from families of intellectuals on both sides of the tree, if you will. So, like I was very fortunate. I came from just like a typical middle class family. I had a mother and father, but I always sort of register that as a norm, but as you get older and you talk to your circle of friends and you share experiences, you realize that's not a fait accompli, that not everybody enjoyed that. So I think that this definitely had an impact. I mean, if you look at Bobby between uh, 49 and 56, uh, for the most part, he would have come home from school and the apartment would have been empty because uh, Regina didn't have the luxury or the resources to have a babysitter or somebody to check in on him, and his sister was already like established in her teens, so he would have been on his own a lot, and especially like in the early 50s. So that also, I think, you know must have had an effect on him, as well. Both those things.
Yeah, I wish I could find that out too. Uh, Thank you for the interview again, and thank you for writing the book. I wrote in my review of it that I don't think anyone's going to manage to surpass you unless they discover something completely new about Fischer. Uh, Again, I really enjoyed it, and I think it's by far the best resource on Fischer we have today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I would add though that new things on Fisher pop up all the time. Just recently, I found out I was given a newspaper from Denver from 1973 that suggested that he was living in Colorado in the fall of 1973 with some members of the Worldwide Church of God. So I don't even know what to think of that. Was he just there for like a month, or and went back to L.A., or was he there for a longer period of time? No clue. But there's two things I'll share with your readers. I made a major error. Uh, if you look there's a photo of Spassky and Tall, and it's of them analyzing a game. And when I was very young and I was a member of the Tacoma Chess Club, I got a book by called The Road to the Summit by Cozens, who's a British author. And it was a book on Spassky's chess career. And I remember he won a famous game against Larry Evans in the Varna Olympiad. And he won with a King's Indian attack on the white side of a Samish. And he put his rooks on the king side and pushed his pawns forward and just checkmated a black. And that game always like just stuck in my memory as one of fun early Spassky game, showing him when he was really at his dynamic best. And I took a quick look at that game and compared it with a photo, and I thought, well, it's clear didn't occur during the game, but maybe it was like an analysis afterwards. And I left it there, which I should not have done, because if I had, I would have noticed that Fischer won, or Spassky won another great King's Indian attack. This King's Indian, excuse me, I'm a little lost of words. He won a famous kingside attack, and it was against Mikla Bobotsov of Bulgaria, and it was played in the Havana Olympiad in 1966. And that is when that picture was taken. So bad on me for that, but hopefully there'll be a second printing, and I'll have a chance to correct that mistake. But
Uh, Thank you again. I hope you liked the interview. John and I had a great conversation, and I enjoyed it a lot. At some point, I hope to gain access to his other books and interview him on them as well. And hopefully, he continues writing on Fischer. He mentioned during our interview that you're going to see next week that he wishes to write a book on Fischer's tour in Argentina in '71, in between his candidate matches, where he played simul's against very strong opponents, 23, 2400, some of them 20 boards at a time. And he mentioned that they were really strong, but they didn't know the openings well. So he tried to gain an advantage out of the opening, and he tried to play very sharp games and win quickly. Now Donaldson is trying to collect those games. And if we had access to a Fischer book where he tried to beat 2,300 players in 20 moves, that would be that would be great. Because of course, during 71, 70, 72, he played the best players in the world and he won on move 50, 60 most of the time. Yeah, I hope you like the book. My interview with John on his next book, Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, is going to be out next Saturday, 3 p.m. Central European time, so stay tuned for that. If you have any suggestions for Chessreads, for the channel, or if you have any questions for me, leave them below, leave them on Discord, email me, stepan@chessreads.com. Yeah, we're hoping to improve the platform. We're working on a new login system that's going to enable community reviews, which is coming out March 1st. So yeah, a lot of new stuff happening, and yeah, I hope you like it. Again, if you have any feedback, let me know. Thank you for watching and see you next week. Bye.